We'd like to welcome everybody in for today's discussion. My name is Owen Smith. I'm with the Regional Alumni Council, and some of my other peers are here. We actually have one up here. Unfortunately, our president, Emily, is not here yet, but I want to welcome you guys here. I also want to really be, we're all excited to see so much Kenyon in DC at one time, in one place, and to see a formalized discussion. I think our alumni group tries to engage local alumni with conversations, help them network, do other work, but this is
That's nice.
the most exciting thing we've seen in a long time. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, Alex. I'm going to turn it over to them. And look for us afterwards if you want to become more involved every day in Kenyon and DC.
Well, I'm going to stand up and say a few things next so I can read better. Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Emily. Everybody who works on the DC Kenyon Alumni Association, which is, of course, the nation's most active alumni group. I'm Tom Karako. I'm with the Center for the Study of American Democracy. And tonight's event really represents, I would say, a partnership between the DC Alumni Group, between the alumni organization on campus, and between us and CSAD. Tonight's event, I think, really should be the first of what we expect to be a number of events like this here in DC. It's an extension of CSAD's work on campus. The job of the center is to host nonpartisan and civil and sober discourse about the issues of the day, and whatever those may be, controversial as they may be. And our topic today, of course, is not merely with just anybody, but with three distinguished Kenyon alum. And the topic is the midterm elections, a retrospective from last week. And the question I've asked all of them to think about and to help us think about is what just happened. And to this end, what just happened? What do the results mean? And how should we go about thinking about this? And to this end, we have three distinguished Kenyon alumni. Cully Stimson, who is a manager manager at Heritage and senior legal fellow with their program. We have, and also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under the Bush administration. We have Paul Brown, partner of Prime Policy, also a former staffer from Senator Daschle, and a good deal of Senate experience. And finally, we have Jen Judson, a defense reporter from Politico. So we have lots to talk about. A lot happened last week, and I'm going to open it up to them to go about 5-8 minutes each, and then we'll go questions between each other and from the audience. So thank you. Why don't we start with Cully?
Well, thank you, Tom, and it's really terrific to be here, especially seeing familiar faces like Ray and Murray and others. And I want to welcome you, Kenyon parents. This should be a nice respite from stroking the huge checks you're stroking to Kenyon. So at least you can earn it back by eating their cheese and their wine. Tom asked us to say a little bit about ourselves before we dive into the many questions he put to us in email. I'm an '86 graduate. I took poli-sci classes. Paul is a friend of mine from Kenyon. We actually lived right down the hall from each other, and we're good buds back then. I was an English major, like many at Kenyon. I did my junior year abroad at Exeter, the Kenyon Exeter program, and I was the captain of the soccer team. And this year's men's soccer team has the best season they've ever had, and they just won the NCAC, which is our league, and they're of course going to win the NCAA men's Division III championship. So to quote, I can't remember who said this, we won and you lost. Who said that? Oh, that was President Obama. I think that's an overstatement and an understatement of what happened last week. But I wanted to put the election somewhat into perspective. I'm speaking not in my capacity as a senior legal fellow at Heritage or a naval officer. I'm just speaking as a Kenyon graduate. So these are my opinions and my opinions alone. If you look back back to 2010, and you take just a running metric of the governorships, the state house and senate wins or losses, the U.S. House wins and losses, and then the Senate wins and losses from the 2010, 2012, 2014 elections, you can see a trend. And let me just tick off some numbers for you. In 2010, the U.S. House of Representatives, the Republicans picked up 63 seats. In 2012, the Democrats picked up 8 seats. And in the 2014 results, the House picked up, the Republicans picked up 12 seats for a net over 6 years of 67 seats. That compares to Bush at this time, where the net was a net loss to Bush, or a net gain to the Democrats of 19 House members. And Clinton at this time, there was a net loss of 47 House seats. That's the House. On the Senate side, 2010, the Republicans gained 5 seats. In 2012, the Democrats gained 2 seats. And we know the Senate now, in the 2014 election, the Republicans gained 7 seats, maybe 8, with Louisiana in the runoff. That's a net to the Republicans of 10 Senate seats over 3 election cycles. On the state level, it's even more dramatic. And I can provide you the numbers at the cocktail reception afterwards, but in 2010, 675 net gain for Republicans across all the states. In 2012, the Democrats clawed back 150 seats at the state level, at the House and Senate. And then here in 2014, the Republicans picked up well over 300 seats, between 300 and 325. Some are not decided yet. And so that's a net gain of over 850 seats across the country. Today, 31 states have a Republican governor, 17 states have a Democratic governor. That's much different than 2010. And in fact, if you look at the numbers from 2009, it's a dramatic shift. And so I think what you can clearly see just by the numbers alone, without making any value judgments, that the Republicans have done well at the state and federal level under President Obama, for whatever reason, and we can debate that. Let me make a couple more points, and then I'll turn it over to my friends and fellow classmates from Kenyon. You hear in Washington that, well, let me start to say it a different way. If the Democrats had had this kind of momentum from 2010 to 2012 to 2014 at the state and federal level, what you would hear today, starting the day after the election, was, we have an overwhelming mandate. The American people have spoken in 3 elections. We can do what we want, and we're going to pass what we want. When Republicans find themselves in this situation, what you hear the mainstream media and others say is, well, it's, you won, but it's time to compromise with the Democrats. And you see Republicans saying, yep, it's time to compromise and be bipartisan. It's an interesting observation. I don't think you can really debate that. Maybe these guys will differ with me. This election was a repudiation, in my mind, of Obama's policies, of his perceived lawlessness and overreach. He said his policies were on the ballot and people spoke. And it's a repudiation of big Washington in the inability of this administration to govern, whether it's the rollout of the website for healthcare.gov, whether it's, you name it, Ebola, you name it, it's not working and the people spoke. It's not a repudiation, as some have been saying, of Washington dysfunction or congressional gridlock. Washington is dysfunctional and there is congressional gridlock, but that's not what it's a repudiation of. The other point I would say from the conservative perspective is that the grassroots had a big say in this election. Turnout numbers were really low, but at the grassroots level, there was a lot of activism. I mean, look at Tom Tillis. I mean, he was down 3 points right to the end, and it was the grassroots that brought him over to the finish line. Tom asked us to address quickly the 2015 priorities, and I'll say what I think the American people were saying in this election what the priorities should be according to them in the exit polls. One is no amnesty. Amnesty should not be part of the game. Now the president has a different opinion, and we'll see what his executive order entails. Next is every Republican that won ran on repealing Obamacare, every single one, and you saw the election results. Whether you think it's a good idea or not is debatable, but that's what they ran on, and they won. Free market direction of the economy. I think Keystone XL pipeline, I think we may see some movement on that. But energy independence, that's clear what's happening in the energy industry, and people who ran on that won. I think either in the lame duck or carried over to the new Congress, we're going to see a debate. It's not going to be as hearty as at least law nerds like I would like, about the AUMF, the authorization for use of military force against ISIS. I think we're going to see a renewed emphasis on the defense budget, which Jen, I'm sure, will talk about, and Paul will as well. I think the cuts that the Defense Department first saw under the Budget Control Act and then the sequester, I think we're going to revisit a discussion about what is adequate funding to secure the country. And then I think you may see efforts at tax reform and maybe easy things to knock off, like easy, air quote, easier things to knock off than massive tax overhaul. So those are my initial points. Turn it over to Paul.
Tom, thank you for this opportunity, and thanks for the college for providing this opportunity. I don't know about Jen and Cully, but I've actually never done a panel at night where there's been alcohol served beforehand. I had sort of I had this nightmare of like 10-cent beer night in Cleveland where there's a riot and everybody's going to be throwing stuff at us. But I stacked the crowd with some friends. So as you could expect, and as is probably emblematic of the dysfunction in Washington, I want to talk about numbers too, but my numbers don't match up with Cully's numbers.
What?
Kenyonites are not math majors.
A little bit of background. After Kenyon, I worked at Congressional Quarterly magazine for a couple of years, and I went to graduate school, got a master's degree in public policy at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and while I was down there, worked for Governor Ann Richards back when they had Democrats in Texas. That was a long time ago. That was like 1991. And then came back after graduate school and worked for Senator Daschle, first on his campaign, and then on his policy committee staff as a policy advisor, and then eventually on his floor staff. So I spent a lot of time reading Senate procedure, learning about amendment trees, and I can talk about Senate procedure because it's extremely important, but I will clear the room if I do that. So I'm going to talk about numbers which sort of underpin Senate procedure. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about my takeaways from the election, which will of course differ somewhat from Cully's, and the way I'm looking at the next couple of years. First, most important number, of course, is 2016. Like it or not, the 2016 campaign began last Wednesday at 12:01 a.m. And the 2016 Senate elections also began at 12:01 on Wednesday. That has a couple of effects. One, shrinks the legislative window of opportunity for next Congress, and everything will be seen through the prism of the presidential election and the Senate elections coming up. The number 7, that's a number of Republican senators up in 2016 from a state that Obama won at least once. 0 is the number of Democratic senators up in 2016 from a state that McCain or Romney won. Completely flips 2014. 5 is the number of Democratic senators left who are from red states that either McCain or Romney won. That's Tester, McCaskill, Heitkamp, Donnelly, Manchin. If you don't include Begich and Landrieu, which unfortunately would be too optimistic to include. I think Landrieu has a shot, but we'll see. 10 are the total number of Republican senators from Obama states. So there's a lot more potentially vulnerable Republicans left than there are Democrats in the Senate. And of course, 60 is the number of senators needed to invoke cloture. So if you do the math, 55 Democratic senators this Congress, 54 Republican senators under the most optimistic scenario for next Congress. So there's a gap between what the Republican majority has and what they need for cloture, and cloture is how you get things done in the Senate. Finally, 2/3 is the number of senators needed to override a presidential veto. That's 67 in a 100 Senate body. So those are the numbers. You can't, it was tough on the Democrats. It will be tough on the Republicans.
I agree with everything you said so far.
Yeah. Just wait.
You're doing good. Just keep going. If you need my notes here, they're right.
So we'll get to that.
Yeah.
I'm an old man. I've been around quite a bit. When I graduated from Kenyon in 1986, I lived in a group house with a couple of Kenyon graduates who were a year older than me. One was my girlfriend. She worked for the only Democratic House member of Congress in 1986 who was defeated. And another of my roommates worked for the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which the Republicans lost the Senate that November. I've seen it starting then. 92 was a highlight of my career when I was working for Senator Daschle. He won re-election in South Dakota, a red state. Bill Clinton won. We took seats in the House and Senate. 2 years later, we gave it all back. 2000, I left the Hill to go become a lobbyist, and when I left was the weeks of which the debate, the Florida court cases were going on. There was no clarity in terms of what would happen in the Senate majority. And then, of course, subsequently, 2008, great Obama victory, give it all back in 2010, win it back again in 2012, give it back again in 2012. We are in a political pendulum period, and I just caution anybody who thinks that there's a mandate that they need to learn the lessons of not distant history, but just 2 years before. Here's what I think happened in the elections. Democrats didn't have a governing majority in the 113th Congress. They could set the agenda, but they couldn't set the outcome. Issues where they knew they couldn't get 60 votes, which was most, they were simply message items. The majority prevented votes on most other controversial Republican items, I think to their detriment ultimately. The few times that President Obama and the 113th Congress were forced either to come together or to fight, Obama won, or it was a draw, a point to the government shutdown of October of last year. Think about this. Remember back then, before the Obamacare rollout, had the elections been in October of 2013, given the beating that the Republicans took in public opinion, these election results would have been completely flipped. Unfortunately, they don't hold elections like that in odd number of years. They hold them in even number of years. But what happened between then and November of this year was significant. The 113th Congress stopped legislating in 2014, at least by the definition of the House and Senate coming together to work out differences on legislation. So when Congress became a media vacuum, essentially doing nothing, attention turned to other issues, including the VA, border crisis, Ukraine, ISIS, Ebola, which became sort of the crises of the week, which Obama didn't appear to handle well, and that drove down his numbers. There was no positive Democratic narrative coming out of this Congress, and quite frankly, out of the White House. Economic progress since 2008, lower unemployment, greater energy independence, withdrawal from Iraq, Afghanistan, all positive stories. We just didn't say those stories. We didn't go out and talk about that. And we also didn't talk, there's no negative narrative about congressional Republican gridlock, because in part the Senate Democrats were responsible. So Obama's foreign policy execution, I think, drove down his job performance numbers. And when Congress stopped legislating, congressional Democrats were really mere bystanders. Even worse, they appeared to be running away from the president, which fed a narrative of a divided and demoralized party, which the cycle just spun even tighter. So essentially, Obama's job performance on foreign policy, which was his job performance, became the Democratic brand, and Republicans definitely nationally exploited that damaged brand. Two things I caution, though, and I think in terms of contrition for how the Senate Democrats approached this, members, especially senators, sometimes need to take tough votes to get things done. They're elected to go to Washington to do something, and to be bystanders, what's the point of being there? Shielding, in particular, shielding vulnerable incumbents from tough amendment votes didn't work. It didn't give red state Democrats tangible votes against the president, and it shut down the legislative process. And running away from previous votes doesn't work. Voters know if you're a Democrat or Republican, and they know if you vote with or against the president. It was just, the campaigns that I saw really were red state Democrats talking about local issues. Sometimes it worked to, I think Kay Hagan did a good job in North Carolina. But nobody was out defending the tough work that they did earlier in their term when they voted for Obamacare, when they voted for Dodd-Frank, all these other things, voted for a stimulus package, which arguably got the country moving in the right direction. So what's going to happen the next couple of years? No crystal ball, but this is what I'm going to be looking for. Right now, all of Obama's legislative legacy items are from his first 2 years. Certainly he will use the veto to defend those. He has a relatively free rein on executive actions now. For the last 4 years, the White House has had 2012, 2014 elections in mind, including protecting those now gone moderate Democrats. For example, on immigration reform. Those concerns are gone. Witnessed this morning the announcement regarding net neutrality. I don't know how many people follow that. That's a very aggressive position on the part of the administration. I think you can see that on immigration and a number of other things. Obama's and the Democratic numbers go up when the president draws a clear contrast with the Republicans, like a government shutdown. Will he get a chance? We'll see. He also has free rein on foreign policy. He had it essentially before, but I don't think there's any check that comes out of this election in terms of foreign policy. Republicans are divided, and they'll mostly be bystanders. I think Obama may compromise on areas like trade and tax reform if he gets the chance, and he won't always please his base. I think there's a good chance that he actually approves the Keystone Pipeline either sometime this year or maybe next year. I don't know how it plays out in terms of when Congress votes on it, but I think it's going through the process, and the signals are that they may do that. And quite frankly, I think the next Democratic president would want him to do it, get it off the table. Republican goals and concerns. All eyes right now, of course, on Mitch McConnell. He's been there 30 years. He's been waiting his whole career for this. He's very experienced, shrewd, practical, believes in the institution of the Senate, and wants to return to regular order, but it'll be easier said than done. Senate Republicans will control the agenda, but they will control the inputs, what gets debated, but not the outputs. And the question is, do they want to legislate or message like the last 4 years? The class of 14 Republicans, people like Joni Ernst, they were elected to stop the Obama agenda. The class of 16 Republicans, Rob Portman, Mark Kirk in Illinois, they're in blue states. They might want to end the gridlock and try to get something done. How does McConnell balance those out? The Republican majority also will control nominations. That's going to be, I think, the biggest difference. And will they return to the 60 vote? Back to your question about the nuclear option, they can go nuclear themselves, and we could see another, we could see either return to 60 votes, which they need to do the nuclear option to overturn a precedent. They could do that in terms of cloture on legislation. But they also have to think about what happens 2 years from now if they have a president. Finally, other nominations, the sole Republican leverage is the purse. And will they shut the government down? They say they don't want to do that. It's going to be tough when that's maybe your only option. I talk a little about some of the other items that are available, but I do want to talk a little bit about the Democratic goals and then wrap up. Gridlock didn't hurt congressional Republicans in 2014. And the question is, will it help or hurt Democrats in 2016? There's no more fun position to be in than the Senate Minority Leader in stopping things and drawing contrasts. I think that's going to work to our advantage. If there's an open amendment process in particular, we'll get votes on immigration or on minimum wage, issues that work to Democrats' advantage and put 2016 Republicans in a tougher spot. Finally, Democrats have the luxury of deciding who stops Republican priorities. Is it the Senate or the president? They have the control. Final thoughts. As a partisan Democrat, it may be good for my party in the long run if Republicans don't compromise and prove that they can govern. As a professional in the lobbying world, it's different. We want things to get done. We want activity. And finally, I just think at this point in our history, we need something, a signal to the American people that we can actually get something done. So I hope that the Republican signals, at least from the Senate, are real, that there will be legislating. There's a possibility of compromise. They're not going to get a lot done. There are some things that they can get done. I think would be good for the country.
All right, well, that's a tough act to follow. It's kind of funny to be up here, actually, because as a reporter, I've often been at CSIS covering things from the front row, looking up. So different vantage point this time around. Just a little background on my Kenyon career, if you want to call it that. I was a history major. I was in Zeta Alpha Pi sorority. Does anyone say nope? And I played lacrosse. No Zetas. And I see another class of OFAR back there, Dan. But yeah, so after Kenyon, spent 4 years trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and I ended up earning a master's degree at BU, and covering the Massachusetts State House there for a semester for free. And so I got into covering politics when I was there and ended up working for a couple of community newspapers, covering politics at the very local level. And after quite a few snowstorms, I decided I wanted to come back to DC and start covering policy. So I ended up being hired at a trade publication called Inside Defense, and covered specifically Army aviation and missile defense for 3 years, very, very much in the weeds. But what that did teach me is a lot of interesting things about how Congress works, how lobbying affects legislation, how the defense industry plays into all of that. And therefore, after 3 years, I decided to pull myself up out of the weeds a little bit and work for Politico, where now I cover Congress, I cover defense policy. So I'm going to focus specifically on defense. I'll try to branch out if I can, but covering an election is not something I've done for the last 4 years, actually. So this is the first time I was up late at night writing copy at 11:30 at midnight in a crowded newsroom while I was starting to come down with a little bit of food poisoning from the pizza. But you know, I can offer a little bit of my earliest thoughts as a result of all that. And you know, there's still a lot to be determined. I don't know how much will get done in the lame duck session. But you know, early on in election night, it became very clear that the GOP was going to take the Senate. That means a lot of important things in terms of defense policy. Most entertaining to me is that McCain will likely take the Senate Armed Services gavel. As we all know, he's no shrinking violet. So I think we're in for some interesting years with him at the helm. But I think there's a very interesting quote from Politico's David Nather, and he wrote this week, what can you actually get done over the next 2 years? Even if you didn't get your hopes up, you should still lower them. So things are sounding sort of grim, especially in the lame duck leading up to January. There, you know, I don't anticipate a lot getting done aside from approving a continuing resolution, which you know, just approves a budget at last year's level. You know, and I just don't think there's a lot of incentive to move a spending bill until at least January, and who knows how long that will take the Republicans to decide what they actually want. But since the Republicans will want to make decisions on the defense budget, they're going to do what they can to prevent it from happening in the next, you know, couple of months. So there's not much appetite there. There's also, I think, not a lot of appetite to pass or approve an AUMF, an authorization of the use of military force. That would authorize the operation that's promised to be years long against ISIL. So there's not much incentive now for lawmakers to do that. And Rep. Buck McKeon, the retiring House Armed Services Committee chairman, said that the new Congress should take up the issue as they'd be in office during the operation's duration, so it would make more sense for them to make that decision. So there's not much incentive there, and then I think there's even less incentive following the lame duck session to approve an AUMF simply because everyone's looking towards 2016. You don't want to have your name on an approval of a war that could potentially end up, you know, going wrong, something could happen, and you know, you don't want to have dirt on your hands or indirect blame for approving a war that could turn sour.
That's why the president wants them to vote on it.
Right, and that is why the president wants them to vote on it now.
Yep.
I doubt that will happen.
And that's why the Constitution's written the way it is.
Right.
That's right.
Right. The lame duck will be lame. So in the new Congress, there'll be a push to approve a budget. There's incentive to get it done, but it'll likely be somewhat delayed. We could see a continuing resolution sort of float for a few months.
And then I think we'll also see a resuming ferocity in the debate on sequestration. I think that the Republicans have a lot of incentive to try to overturn sequestration, although there are plenty of Republicans, I think, who actually do favor sequestration. I think Mitch McConnell may be one of the folks that has said in the past that he thinks sequestration is a good mechanism. So McCain and McConnell may fight against each other on this one. But that's the most important thing for the Defense Department. They want to see sequestration overturned, and so does defense industry. So one of the interesting things that I think will happen since McCain will have the Senate Armed Services gavel is while he is a hawk for defense industry, he's criticized the Boeing tanker program back in the day. He was in charge of an investigation that ended up with the Boeing's chief financial officer in jail, as well as a program officer from the Defense Department. I think he's going to ride on that train, attack F-35, attack other Lockheed Martin programs. Specifically, Raytheon may get off a little bit because of their connection to Arizona. But at the same time, since he's fighting to overturn sequestration, the defense industry does have a friend in McCain. You know, as far as the rest of the leadership in Senate Armed Services that we'll see, I don't know. I tried to put out a story yesterday, I think it was, that it ran, where I tried to decide who was going to take over each subcommittee, and that was like playing with a Rubik's Cube. So I don't really know who else the leadership will be involved in terms of, you know, who McCain keeps close to him, or how that will affect the decisions that they make. But we'll see what happens. That's to be decided. Another thing that we could see is overseas contingency operations funding is likely to increase by a lot. I think especially if sequestration is not overturned, we could see a war chest continue. It was something that was supposed to be phased out at the end of the Afghan war. It's looking highly likely that it's going to stick around for a long time. The president, I think, just asked for about $5-point-something billion in addition to $65.8 billion just for this current fiscal year for OCO. So that's going to be, we're going to see that sort of as a mechanism to get around funding weapon systems in the base budget. So that's going to be a way to pay for national security. I don't know for how long, but it's looking like it's going to stay for a while, and that could really affect the budget. It looks like we have a low base budget, but we're actually spending a lot more money on defense that way. So I guess in closing, you know, it's not certain whether the parties can meet in the middle and get real work done in the next 2 years, but you know, one thing's for certain is that we're still going to face a lot of uncertainty, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans in the majority. You know, there's still obviously major hotspots in the world. We didn't predict that we were going to be involved in certain conflicts and combating diseases in Africa. That, you know, we didn't expect that 6 months ago. So providing the Defense Department more certainty is going to be key, and I think that's going to be on the agenda for the Republicans, especially since they do tend to favor the defense industry. A lot of these big weapon systems contractors often are positioned around the country in GOP voter areas, so it's very important for them to kind of stick to the defense industry side on issues. You know, without certainty, the military's ability to respond to contingencies, you know, to throw cold water on hot spots is, you know, that's going to decrease as the military shrinks.
Good. Well, thank you, each of you, for this. I want to open up to questions from the audience, but while you're thinking about your question, I want to direct one very pointed what next question, and to each of you as a follow-up. Unfortunately, Jen is very pessimistic about my what next for sequestration question. So I think this is mainly for Coley and for Paul. Coley, you, I think, said in the third person, if the Democrats had won these numbers, it would have been seen as a mandate. So the question for you is this a mandate? Yes or no? Should it be perceived as one by Republicans, and should they act accordingly? And then likewise, I think, Paul, you did something similar, which is to say, because the Republicans don't have 60 votes in the Senate, they of course have to be more moderate, they should be more moderate. But flipping that logic around, will Democrats in the minority in the Senate be more chastened? and should they be more ready to go along as well? So there's different versions of the same question for each of you. You want to just do this real quick?
Yeah. Political power is evanescent. You have it for a period of time, and then it goes away. It's like evanescent evidence. It's sort of there, and then it can be flushed down the toilet like drugs. It's a legal concept, but you get the point. And so I really like Paul's numbers in the beginning because I agreed with all of them. Because more Republicans are in cycle in vulnerable states in 2016, it's just as likely that we could have one of these ever-present pendulum swings that we've seen the past few cycles. But that doesn't take away from the fact that they are now in leadership. And you can either spend your political power wisely when you have a short window of time to do it, or you can fail. Let me show you what failure looks like. You sign an executive order the first week in your office promising to close Gitmo. Your party's in control of the House and Senate, and then you choose not to spend the political power, political capital to close Gitmo in the first 2 years of your office. Your window closed. There is, to Paul's point, we are in a presidential election cycle now. It started last week. And so Paul's exactly right that everything that is happening that people will be taking, that moves they'll be taking on the Hill, will be seen through the eyes of how that's going to affect this candidate or that candidate. But that can't be allowed to create a situation of stasis where nothing happens, because something has to happen. And so I think because bills originate in the House and go to the Senate, and because people realize that Harry Reid filled the tree and bottlenecked tons of legislation, and that was really, to Paul's point, didn't help certain Senate Dems because then they couldn't distinguish themselves from the president. The Republicans all realize this. They know they have to do something. They know they have to do things that the people have been talking about, the things that they can try to do. And I think what you're going to see is you're going to see them passing bills and that either on the first measure that potentially could get the president's signature, and then they're going to pass other things that will draw a bright and clear line that the president may veto between where the Republicans of this century are and where the Democrats are, and draw a nice line between where Hillary and those who run with her are on one side and where the Republicans are on the other.
I think the Democrats really are, to get to this point was painful. Obviously you lost a lot of good, serious, moderate, thoughtful Democratic senators. But the imperative for Democrats going forward is not to appear to be moderate. I think it's to focus on the issues that we really didn't focus on this Congress, which are the economic issues, and let the Republicans come to them. The House will pass anything. Dale Bumpers, who's a senator from Arkansas, during the Clinton impeachment trial said that a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. Well, the House of Representatives will pass a bill and call it a ham sandwich. I mean, you can pass anything out of the House. I don't want to say it's not relevant, but the House is where you deliver message items.
Senate staff.
Well, that's why they all leave the House to go to the Senate.
Yeah.
But the Senate is where all good bills or bad bills go to die, or maybe to have a second life. When Obama, first 2 years of his administration, a lot of my Democratic colleagues who had been in the House would lament the Senate and say, how come they can't get anything done? And you ask them that question now. Do you wish the Senate weren't there? The Senate is where things get worked out. And so the Democrats don't really have to worry about their 2016 candidates. They do have to worry about the presidential candidate, and that's going to be tricky. I think you'll see a high degree of coordination if Hillary is the nominee between her campaign and this White House, who was part of this administration. A lot of people worked in both. People like John Podesta worked for Hillary and worked for Obama. So they will do everything in sync. Remember how good the Democrats looked. Tom Daschle, as the minority leader in the United States Senate, looked after the Republican Revolution in '95 and '96. how far the Republicans overreached, how Daschle was the one who stood at the breach and stopped the Republican onslaught. All he did was use the procedure that's available to him. It's the same thing the Republicans did this time. Yes, you want to look moderate, but you want to do it on your terms, and I think they can do that. If Mitch McConnell has an open amendment process, they're going to be able to offer their amendments to anything the Republicans offer and get votes on them. And that didn't happen to the detriment of the Democrats, but I think it's a risk the Republicans run in having an open amendment process. We'll see how long that lasts. But it's a lot easier to be in the minority and to make the majority come to you on your terms.
If I could pick up on something Jen said, and by way of background, I didn't do the good job that Paul did. When I left Kenyon, I worked in prep schools for a few years, then I went to law school. Then I joined the Navy, where I served several tours on active duty, served overseas, and then I was a federal prosecutor and law professor, and then I worked in corporate America, and then went to the Defense Department, as Tom said. And last year, when I testified before the full SASC on the AUMF, remember last year, the administration said they wanted to repeal the 2001 authorization for use of military force and the 2002 AUMF. And the administration officials who testified in the panel right before me said that. The ASD for Solik said that this confrontation could last 10 to 20 years. Now with the rise of ISIS, which the administration's position is Al-Qaeda is ISIS and ISIS is Al-Qaeda, even though ISIS was formed in 2004 and was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time. The administration's position today is that the 2001 and the 2002 AUMF covers ISIS, but the president wisely said would he be open to working with Congress on this. I think actually the president is going to send over an AUMF, and I actually think there's going to be a debate in the new Congress, and I actually think there's going to be a vote on it. And I think in large part because there's going to be an effort, to use the president's words, to right-size the authorization and maybe get rid of any of the detritus from the old AUMF that's not necessary anymore, sort of vestigial, and you can sort of put it to rest. But I think we will see that next year. I could be wrong.
Another option could be amending the current AUMF
Yeah.
too. But not that they, my argument is not that they would not pick it up and potentially vote on it, but its success I question just
Yeah.
because of the incentive level to
Yeah.
actually carry through on that. Because the president can just go ahead and continue what he's doing. So if Congress can stay out of it,
Yeah. The
they'll
danger
try.
is because the president and his party perceives that they got burned on the request for Syria the year before, is to not put something out there. But I think things have radically shifted even the last 3 weeks, such that I think the president's going to do the right thing and he's going to put forward an ISIS specific.
I think
John
it-
Boehner said that he wanted them to.
Yeah.
McKeon.
Yeah.
I think he brings them down to the White House as much as he can and brings them into the fold and helps them own the issue. He owned everything in the last year and got burned on it. I think they've got to do a better job of bringing people in the tent. And I think, these guys ultimately stepped up and took some risks on the Republican side and some of these issues. And I think he can do that and just sort of share the risk a little bit better.
But whether that happens on domestic policy will be another matter. Why don't we open up to questions from the audience and make it a discussion? Yeah.
Step back, looking at the more philosophical level, since this is the Center for American Democracy. One thing that seems to be emerging in these trends of turnout, that the elections are all turnout driven, and you have this funny dynamic where you have one party which primarily benefits from low turnout, one party that benefits from high turnout. And I just wonder, so each party is, doing what they can either to, suppress turnout or to drive turnout.
So just to repeat the question for everybody to get hear it, the question of turnout and partisan divide, and whether one party or another exploits that.
Can I take that
good
just
or
from
bad?
the Democratic side? Look, everyone remembers the enthusiasm and the positive spirit and the people that were brought into the process when Obama was elected, and how quickly those people dissolved. When compromise was required on things like the Affordable Care Act, when you didn't have single payer, when the president appeared to be compromising on other issues, including Gitmo. We've got to get people to be invested in democracy in the long run and not look at things as in these short windows, and if you don't get something, you're not going to be part of the process. I don't know what the secret is. Democrats have to do a better job of retaining voters in the midterm period. We have to do a better job as a party. I've seen people talking about reinvigorating the Democratic National Committee. You need somebody who's going to be coordinating. I mean, we have great technology, but you can't use that technology if people are turned off. You've got to get people, keep them involved. And with Republicans, I think you remember Reince Priebus, who is the Republican National Committee chair, wrote this manifesto about how Republicans had to change after the 2012 elections. I think they did a little bit of that, but a lot of it they didn't have to do because we just didn't turn out. They may find out again in 2016. I think that's what the Republicans will have to go through, is like, how much do we have to change in order to be a presidential party as opposed to a congressional party? And we've got to do this. We've got to flip that around if we're going to get the Congress back.
I love Paul. And I particularly love his comment about the compromise on the Affordable Care Act. And of course, the Republicans weren't even in the room on that.
Well, they were, but for a few months at
they
least.
didn't vote for it. No Republican
vote for
voted
it.
for it, right. And so, setting that aside, to your broader point, when you have 2/3 of an electorate that, for one reason or another, whether they're a basement grad, as they're called, and they voted for Obama the first time, and then they graduated, and now they don't have a job, and they're living in their parents' basement, or they're underemployed, or they're not employed to their fullest ability.
A lot more of them are employed now than they were when he took over.
Basement grads
True.
is a term
That's
that
true.
came up under the Obama administration for good reason. And you see the high unemployment rate, or whatever the reason is. And Republicans go through their woes when they lose and go through their soul searching. The Democrats will go through theirs when they lose. This pendulum's going back and forth. I don't think the alternative of making voting mandatory and making it a crime not to vote, like in Australia, is the solution. I know that's alluring to some people. I don't know about how you guys feel about it, but I don't think that's the solution. And I hear from my friends on both sides of the aisle, politics is meaner today than it's ever been. Really? Are people dueling with guns in the streets like they were 200 years ago? Are people breaking out in fist fights and giving people concussions on the House floor like they were back then? It's not any meaner. It's just we're in a different era and a different time, and I think the cumulative effect of the cynicism and the negativity towards politics, whichever side of the aisle you're on, pushes the voter participation level down on both sides. And I think that's a broader problem. And I don't know what the cure is, but I think that's in large part the answer to your question.
And I just add that, I say a lot of the upsets are possibly to blame of, voters just really losing faith in the status quo. You're not going to want to vote for the same people that are screwing things up for you. And so, seeing the Democrats in the majority in the Senate, having, Obama's lost a lot of faith in people that voted for him, and therefore you're going to see some turnaround and you'll see the Republicans take over. I think that's sort of the usual ebb and flow. It's just voters not being happy with what's going on right now, and there certainly hasn't been a lot going on right now in Congress, and so you want to do something differently. You don't want to make the same mistakes.
The danger, and this is on both sides of the aisle to me, is you're losing a generation of legislators. When you think of all the moderates on both sides, when I started in Washington back in the day, the people like John Danforth, Dick Lugar, Sam Nunn, there was a core group of moderates in both parties on both sides of the Hill, and those people are for the most part gone. And Democrats came in 2008, a lot of Democrats who wanted to overturn the Senate rules and agitating for all these changes because the Senate didn't work. Well, they didn't appreciate the traditions of the Senate, and knowing that the Senate could work when people trusted each other, knew each other, and work across the aisle. That's gone for the most part, with a few exceptions on both sides. It's gone altogether, I think, in the House. There's maybe 5 or 6 moderates left in the House. It's not healthy, and people, it's difficult to find a cure for that, because if you find a cure, you're going to disadvantage one party or the other.
And that begins in the primary process.
Yep.
The gentleman with the poppy.
In the context of the last question, the Republican governors have been very effective in efforts to engage in voter suppression through voter ID laws and things of that sort. Do you think there's any likelihood that this voter suppression effort will backfire on the Republicans?
Well, with all due respect, I completely reject your premise. In the states that enacted voter ID laws, voter numbers have gone up. Look at Indiana, look at North Carolina, and other states. Name one story out there today about the states that recently enacted voter ID where somebody was denied the ability to vote, even in places where Democrats won. Nowhere. And so I don't think that, I reject your premise out just off from the very beginning. We use ID for all sorts of things, to get prescription drugs, to get on an airplane, to do all sorts of things in life. And so the mantra that voter ID is a tool of decades past in voter suppression is just not, to me, a credible argument at all. And in fact, it's belied by the numbers of blacks who, in states where voter ID was passed, the number who voted went up after voter ID was passed, including in Indiana. And so, for those of you who don't follow the Supreme Court ruled that voter ID is constitutional. John Paul Stevens, the liberal lion, authored that opinion. And so I think it's a good talking point for the left. It's, like a lot of talking points from the left, belied by the facts on the ground.
Well, I think we'd have more of a body of evidence if the courts hadn't stepped in and actually stopped a lot of these laws that were passed by Republicans from going forward. The other thing that I'd have more confidence that the Republicans were trying to bring credibility to the process if they could point to evidence of voter fraud that had occurred. To me, it looks like it is voter suppression, unless you can point to something that's a cause for this. To me, it's using your power, just like you use power for gerrymandering, which is perfectly legal, legitimate. It hurts the process, but it's using power. Now there's discussion about Republican legislatures using their ability to change the electoral college to go to proportional representation. That could materially affect the 2016 election. Perhaps it's legal, we'll see, but it's an issue that I don't think is fully joined because we don't have a body of evidence either way, but I think there's certainly no evidence, credible evidence and substantial evidence pointing to the need for these, to make it harder for people, particularly people who are poor, who don't have ID not because they don't want people to know who they are, but they don't need it and they don't have the means to get it. And to disenfranchise those people for your own electoral concerns, to me, is very cynical.
And in the states that passed voter ID laws, they not only made it free, but they gave people the ability to have state workers come deliver them to the DMV and get them an ID for free. Secondly, there is credible evidence, in fact it's a large body of evidence in terms of case convictions that Heritage put together of many vote fraud convictions across a whole spectrum of vote fraud And it's available on heritage.org. You can download it for free. It's in a PDF, it's in color, and it's by case name, by state, and by year. And they're year after year after year after year. And so we put that together because we know that this talking point seems to be bouncing around the liberal left and the media, and it's just no there there because it's just not true.
All right.
Making a bystander out of you.
I can't voice an opinion on this.
Yeah,
I'm a
she's a
reporter, and this is
reporter.
way out of my
Let's
wheelhouse.
move to some bigger issues. Over here in the back. Gentleman in the striped tie.
Thank you. A lot of my work takes me to sub-Saharan Africa, and throughout the evening, I've only heard Ebola mentioned twice in passing. And I was wondering if you can unpack if or how Ebola really played into this election, whether it swung any voters and so forth, and if we are speaking sort of on a personal level, whether you think there's any legitimacy to the hype that this administration has been asleep at the wheel or so on and so forth, given the frankly negligible body count.
I think you have a good point in one sense that I think those who were trying to use Ebola as, Exhibit A, that the administration was doing nothing and was incompetent, they were just wrong. I mean, of course the administration is run, administrations, there's a small sliver of people who are political appointees. And then there's a vast administrative state, including the Public Health Service, including the military, including DOD, elsewhere, that are working these issues on a daily basis. I think what may have hurt politically ever so slightly is when the president stood up and said, we're not going to have any Ebola person or Ebola coming to the United States, and then all of a sudden you have Mr. Duncan coming, and then the 2 nurses getting infected, and I think people may have exploited that to some gain. I wouldn't have any way of knowing, frankly, whether that hit the meter, pushing people to the polls. I highly doubt it, frankly. I think what it may have done, though, is it may have played into the meme that this is yet another example of an administration that's not capable of handling a crisis. But that may have been, the last little Lego on top of a Lego pile that had been built a while ago. But I don't know. Paul probably might have a better sense than I would.
Well, I think just from the defense perspective, the Defense Department has played the biggest role in responding to Ebola, and will likely, a lot of it will come out of overseas contingency operations funding as well. And so I think it shows that if we continue to go down the route of sequestration or other defense spending issues that we may be facing, being able to afford to respond to deal with Ebola, that's a big issue. Like, are we going to be able to send troops to places where we can't predict? We can't predict that there's going to be an Ebola outbreak somewhere and that the Defense Department is needed to respond. It's that serious. But we saw 2 examples this summer where the Defense Department had to jump and respond and either fund targeted airstrikes or send large amounts of troops. Quite a few large amounts of brigades. It's going to cost. They just asked for another $6 billion for Ebola. So I think it's just another example of the fact that we are driving ourselves very deep into debt if we can't figure out how to pay for these things. We also need to look at how we respond to these things. So I think that sort of kind of opens up the debate that we'll see congressionally and how to respond.
Yeah, I think it certainly didn't help the administration and the Democrats at the time that it happened. It's another example of sort of I don't want to discount it by calling it a story of the week or of the month, but it was one of those things that just flared up and everybody was demanding an immediate response. The response initially was unclear because they weren't sure of the extent of the crisis. I think if you look at it now, it's fair to say that it appears to be, thank God, contained for the most part, certainly in this country. Look, it was something that the private sector, the individual hospitals didn't quite know how to respond to. It's an unprecedented issue, but you put something like that in the context of a political campaign and demand a cogent political response that's going to help Democrats. It's very difficult. In fact, they did a courageous thing by resisting shutting the borders. And even though they were hearing a lot from Republicans in Congress and some Democrats, It was a rational, to some degree, response. It was fear, but it was, but they were able to point out why it wouldn't be the right thing to do. And I think in the long run, they were right, but they probably paid a price politically.
So I want to be respectful of people's time. I know we said we conclude after about an hour. We can continue this over drinks, but I want to give everybody an opportunity to kind of do a wrap up. And I thought I'd pitch a softball for any last thoughts you have. And that is a number of you, all three of you really, talked about kind of the problem of spin that we're hearing of in the usual political news cycle. What is it about maybe a Kenyon education or a liberal arts education that you think is important to sort through what you hear from the talking heads and as we think about these things?
Let's start.
Once you start, you are
Ladies first.
This
You
was
know,
ours.
I
You're the
think it's
journalist.
important because in all of our classes, our small classes, you sit down and you debate with one another, and you're able to have civil conversations, and you may or may not agree with one another during your coursework. And I think that translates to what I do as a journalist. I have to weigh, both sides of the equation and try to be as fair as I possibly can in my reporting. I know the media is often criticized for slanting in one way or the other, but I think a Kenyon education really trains you to look at both sides, consider everything, and also, if you have an opinion, being willing to change your mind if somebody convinces you of that. So I think I learned that at Kenyon, and being able, and also questioning everything you're told, not accepting everything you're told as fact.
I think responsible citizenship requires you to be well-read on issues, to think critically, and to try to frame your own beliefs in some kind of context and not just be an ideologue. And that's what I think a liberal arts degree has. I think I'm a liberal Democrat, I think, in a lot of ways. I'm maybe more moderate on some issues, but I try to stop and think about both sides of the issue. It's one thing that we're certainly missing in our political system now, in a rush to judgment with social media kind of environment where everything has to be put into 140 characters in a tweet. Taking the long view and seeing both sides of an issue is very important. I think the liberal arts degree is very helpful in that regard.
I'll incorporate by reference both of their comments, and it goes without saying that Kenyon people can sit on a stage and disagree vehemently and have a drink afterwards. And there's a lot to be said
There was
for that.
vehement
Which-
disagreement.
Which is what we're going to go do.
There's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for those of you who have students at Kenyon, and for those of you who had the privilege of going to Kenyon or Yale or wherever you went, none of us got anywhere important in life without the help of somebody or people. And you look at the people like Judy Smith, who was a tremendous English professor, or Fred Turner, who was my mentor at Kenyon in the English department, who taught me the love of language and the beauty of Shakespeare and how Shakespeare's love of history and politics really is relevant to this day. How Fred Bauman's course or Kirk Emmert's course, make you realize that facts matter. There is truth sometimes. There is a need to debate these things and grow as people. And that forced intimacy of living on the hill together, apart from a big city, gives you the time to breathe and work through those issues. And that's what makes Kenyon special.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for your thoughts and your time. And thanks to everybody for coming out. Like I said, we're going to do more of this. And actually, next week on November 19 at 9 o'clock, we're going to have the wife of Kenyon alum Leopoldo Lopez, who's in prison in Venezuela. She'll be here in this room talking about his experience. We're also going to do more of these events, I hope, in the coming year. And as a closing thought, I hope Cully is right about the AUMF. I hope, Jen, you're wrong about sequestration, and I'm quite sure Paul is right about the numbers. So, thank you.